All right, welcome back to Seaside Joe. We are live. I'm Kenneth Arthur. With me as always, and again, Thad Wenatchee, aka Thad is Rad, aka the Thad guy who does all the great links. You know what I mean? It's
Your daily links, woolly
Terrence.
mammoth.
So many names for so many talents, but here we are, the Seattle Seahawks, 1 week into training camp. Now we're getting into, more of the things that are happening that people are reporting on, so more closely aligned to the thing that I really care about, which is football and actually being able to watch the games and everything. So we're even closer to that and seeing some of these players get prepared to integrate into Pete Carroll's team philosophy, system, Shane Waldron, Clint Hurt, so many
Yep.
names to discuss, and here at Seaside Joe, we just happen to like to be prepared for that kind of stuff. So that's why it's been such a busy off season, and I think we're going into training camp now. Anybody that's been following Seaside Joe is going in super prepared for these players, especially this rookie class, all the stuff that's been going on. Very few surprises if you've been following Seaside Joe, and you can do that at seasidejoe.substack.com and subscribe to the newsletter. It's completely free, but there are bonus posts if you want to upgrade. That's totally up to you. Every day a free Seahawks newsletter, so you can do that at the Seaside Joe Substack or follow on Twitter at Seaside Joe News to get updates there. And very excited to be getting into training camp and starting to find out things that we expected to happen and things that we did not expect to happen. Like right now, the Seahawks signing J.R. Sweezy. So that's
Oh,
something that would be on the unexpected side of things. Whereas on Thursday, the Seahawks extended DK Metcalf, which was expected for Seasiders. I think we've all been waiting for this. I just said, hey, don't worry, it'll happen. The Seahawks also are going to make it happen early in camp because you want to have DK Metcalf participating as soon as possible, and it's inevitable anyway, so just do it. And I said I was expecting a 3-year, $72 million contract, and the Seahawks gave DK Metcalf a 3-year, $72 million contract. We can talk about contracts. We can talk about, how they're kind of simple to figure out, really, I think. The only thing that DK Metcalf could have done was add additional years to the deal, other than like talking about guaranteed money, which was probably the longest sticking point between the Seahawks and DK Metcalf. But all those extra years beyond 3 years don't really matter that much anyway at this point. So for now, the Seahawks bring in DK Metcalf back, and that was always expected. And we're starting to get a sense of this roster, and we'll talk about that for 2022. But since the Seahawks did sign DK Metcalf to a new contract, it's kind of, another symbolic gesture towards loading up this offense for a quarterback in 2023. So you get DK Metcalf to do that. Thad, what was your reaction to bringing back DK Metcalf? Any fear, I guess, in terms of, because people get very wrapped up in the money and not being able to do things like trades or whatever. But what was your reaction to the deal?
well, first off, do you recall what my prediction was?
You tell. No, I don't.
You don't listen. 3 years,
Never.
69 million. That was my
Oh,
prediction.
great. Yeah.
But I'm going to credit that also to some random person I saw on Twitter. That was their um, prediction, but I think that prediction was also a nod to DK's exploits on Snapchat.
It's always
But
good to get a nod in there.
but it's close, man. Right? That it's like you said. It made sense. I too was I had several friends that were freaking out. The people I talked to, they didn't think they thought they were thinking bad thoughts about DK sticking around and but I had seen DK. I had mentioned a few episodes ago with you, like there was DK on like Kevin Garnett's podcast, and he was very calm, and he was like, "It's all good. We're gonna get a deal done." He was on the Kevin Hart podcast, just not really even evading the question, but he wasn't like really addressing it either. He was like, "It's all good. It's gonna get done." So
He needs to get on the Kevin Pollock podcast or something. Keep going.
get on the Kevin Pollock one. Now that he's an actor, he's gonna get that Screen Actors Guild card. He's gonna get the good dental plan and all that stuff.
That's right.
Yeah. So no, I mean, like it to me, it's just another step, like you said, to some extent. Like I'm excited about the team continuing to build around either one of three quarterbacks that are already on the roster or somebody in the future.
It seems like it's a move that was going to happen. It was necessary, and there was no reason to feel any sort of emotion about it. I think because it's for a fan, it's not just out of your hands. It's just like the most logical conclusion was the same as it always is. Teams typically do not let their star players at this stage in their careers get away. You could really count the number of players in that position, like a DK Metcalf, to switch teams. You could count them on one hand every year. Some years, maybe none of them. I mean, it really just doesn't happen that often. Even if you look at, there's been a lot of big player movement. I do know that. But in terms of guys that are 3 years into the league and they're a Pro Bowler and they're like so dominated such that it's just in one of those situations, especially for a team like Seattle that doesn't have a ton of other players to pay. We knew that they could come up with the money. What I also want to really emphasize for people out there is this: as long as the team can come up with the money and believes that that player is of that caliber, and there was no reason to think that the Seahawks didn't feel that way about DK Metcalf, then it's not like DK Metcalf can go get more money from someone else. It doesn't quite, I think, work that way, because really when you look at all the contracts signed by wide receivers this year, as I wrote on Seaside Joe, when you break it down into those 3 years, they're really not that much different. So once Terry McLaurin, which is why I also wrote on Seaside Joe after Terry McLaurin signed his contract, that this is the framework. This is exactly what the Seahawks are going to do, plus a teensy bit more. It was easy to say, okay, Terry McLaurin, his contract was up to $71 million. It's actually more like $69 million, like you were saying, Thad, if they were going to just match that. It's up to $71 million. So I said 71.5 or $72 million. DK Metcalf couldn't go to another team and get 3 years and $90 million. It just doesn't work that way. So the only other thing that they could have done was, like the Titans, they didn't feel that A.J. Brown was a franchise wide receiver. Otherwise, they would have kept A.J. Brown. I think that they were in a position where maybe even financially, they decided we're not going to put that kind of money into the wide receiver position at this time. So they got A.J. Brown. They moved him at the time that they could. That's another thing, too, that I think people don't really fully grasp. That is I think when people even talk about losing DK Metcalf or trading DK Metcalf, for one, the time to trade to DK Metcalf already passed this year, which is why A.J. Brown and Tyreek Hill and Devontae Adams and Marquise Brown were all traded prior to the draft. So once that passed, going into next year, it just, the deal had to happen. There was no real any other way around it, especially for Metcalf's side, why he wasn't participating. He was going to get paid. So that was the whole thing that, if there was ever going to be a real roadblock there, it wouldn't happen. But if the Seahawks had traded DK Metcalf, I know it's easy to assume like, wow, he's so great. We love him so much. He must return like a top 5 or a top 10 pick, right? And that wasn't the value that we were seeing, even with Tyreek Hill, who the first round pick that the Chiefs got for Tyreek Hill was 29th overall. And if you look at Devontae Adams, similar range. Even if you look at A.J. Brown, you're looking at like the 20th pick in the draft, which for me, I mean, Thad, you would never want. I mean, why would you want the 20th pick if you could have DK Metcalf instead? Am I right?
I mean, unless there's some position group that you desperately need, but no way. I mean, especially because the quarterback play is going to be, even if Locke and Smith have good seasons, it's still going to be significantly less impactful than a Russell Wilson season, even like a 78%, 80% Russell Wilson kind of season, so you need those pieces around him. I mean, it'd be like, getting rid. It's why they drafted so well at offensive line. They knew they needed help. Like now you can't have Geno or Locke back there trying to complete passes with a really disjointed, unintentional offensive line. You needed some intent, so that's why they made those picks. It just seems
Yeah,
like they're just being really logical, which makes me happy, honestly, as a fan. They're being very logical this offseason.
that's what and that's again, so what I wrote about this morning on Seaside Joe was Pete Carroll has been doing this, for a very long time in Seattle. Very few. There's only 3 head coaches now with longer tenures than Pete Carroll. All those guys, even Mike Tomlin, he doesn't have full control. It's not just fully, really, it's just Bill Belichick and Pete Carroll are these guys that have been around for more than a decade who act as, sort of head coach and GM. Obviously, John Schneider is involved too, to a great extent, but really, everything is kind of built around, well, this is the way we play football. So these are the guys that we're looking for, and this is the way that we operate. And we're not going to panic at any given moment. We're never going to panic over a player, whether it's a guy coming in or a guy going out, which is why the Seahawks don't get involved in the first wave of free agency, often not even the second wave of free agency, or however you want to categorize those tiers. The Seahawks want to keep their good players. That's the way that it's always been. So they want to keep their good players. So it's just very easy to break down what the Seahawks plan is because it's so consistently been the same thing every year. Even the Russell Wilson trade, to a large degree, just goes and falls within Pete's philosophy of not really emphasizing so much on the quarterback position. It wasn't the way that the Seahawks won the Super Bowl in 2013, even though I don't think that they could have done it without Russell Wilson. If they had Tavares Jackson, obviously it's a totally different season. But at the end of the day, there was so much value to the way that the offense was set up at that time with Russell Wilson and everything else that they were doing. So yeah, it just feels like that 2010, 2011 era where you're just doing like really smart moves at the positions that you can upgrade right now. Like back then it was get Marshawn Lynch, and this time it's, hey, let's re-sign Rashad Penny and draft Kenneth Walker. And, back then it was Russell Okung at left tackle, and this time it's Charles Cross is the top 10 pick at left tackle. So just setting all the tone. And even back then, Doug Baldwin, phenomenal player, didn't quite know how good he was even back in 2011, 2012. It was nothing compares to like now setting up for the next quarterback, saying Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. And even though I often try to caution people against, having too much optimism long-term for receivers that are 29, 30 years old, it's just reality. It's nothing against anybody personally. It will never be that way. It's just, that's the way that what we've been seeing. That's the trends, is that once you get 30, 31-year-old wide receiver, they just stop appearing in the NFL. And so Tyler Lockett's getting close to that, but I do think that he will continue to be a wide receiver on the Seahawks in 2023. So, that's such a softer landing spot if the Seahawks do draft a quarterback next year, which I keep saying that I expect them to do that too. So of all the things I've predicted, so far this year, all the major ones have been pretty spot on. And so I think I'm continuing to believe that 2023 will be the quarterback year. I also mentioned the Seahawks bringing back J.R. Sweezy. And what do you think? Have you heard anything out of camp this week that would make this make more sense in terms of bringing back J.R. Sweezy?
I mean, I can only attribute it to the youth on the offensive line, and then wanting to have somebody that's worked with the Hawks before, worked within some of the schemes that they're trying to use. J.R. Sweezy's pretty straight ahead. He's kind of like a one-trick pony, So why not just kind of add to the youth and get a guy in there who's got experience, who knows how to play, he's tough.
Is there anything that you've noticed at field goals or reading about Seahawks news this week in terms of the camp standouts, guys that you feel personally more like intrigued by because of this week?
I mean, from what I've read, the defense is ahead of the offense right now, and the offensive line's been making some good plays, but they've been playing. The defense has been playing really well, especially the defensive line. So I don't know if it's a question of, Sweezy is just depth, you know what I mean? So I don't think it's like, oh, the Hawks think that their offensive linemen are terrible, you know what I mean? I just think that they know there's like a lot of youth on there and they need some experience. I mean, no matter what happens, good or bad this season, I think Pete Carroll and he probably expects the offensive line to go through some.
So I do have to
bumps,
cut
you know what I
in,
mean?
butt in, just because I'm reading on fieldgoals.com that J.R. Sweezy is signing a 1-day contract. So he
Oh
will
wow,
do the KJ Wright retirement.
that's cool.
Because that's like, I mean, at least I don't feel as bad because everybody reported it as the way that it was originally. So yeah, it's
Yeah,
just,
it seems like the O line's like doing fine. They're just,
yeah.
but the defense right now is a bit ahead. I mean, the best I've been hearing though, honestly, is about Kobe Bryant. Have you been hearing? I've been hearing really good things about Kobe Bryant.
So do you think that there's anything going on? Like we're looking at the depth chart here, and I do want to look into this season, and I want to also look ahead to next season. And we know that at cornerback, it's kind of like there's all these veterans who are on 1-year contracts who are probably not going to be around in 2023, maybe unless, I think obviously ideally Sidney Jones has a solid season
Yeah,
and gets a 3-year contract next year. Obviously, Artie Burns, same thing. It's just that he's new to Seahawks fans. He's not new to Clint Hurt or I think Sean Desai. So, like with that connection to the Bears from the last couple of years, I think that's why Artie Burns could be a guy to watch. But yeah, that's the whole thing is that if Kobe Bryant is the guy that's expected to be more ready right now, and then if Tariq Woolen flashes enough to make you think he could start in a year from now, then obviously that changes the dynamic and the need for some of these veteran cornerbacks to do things that they haven't really done in their careers to this point, which is why they're on 1-year contracts. And obviously Justin Coleman is just kind of like a very familiar face who's not who's brings that experience. And maybe I don't want to say he has like a high floor or anything, because I think there's a reason he was available, but at the end of the day, I think obviously he's a guy that they trust to be in that nickel spot or to do the right things. So
yeah.
anyway, yeah, like with Kobe Bryant, you're saying that he's probably that first initial guy to think could fill that role.
I think it's going to be Jones and Bryant most likely, and then you'll have just because they're going to play a lot of nickel and dime, so you're going to rotate guys in. So I mean, to me that's exciting. Because you have all this depth. With Burns, and fighting for the QB2, QB3. They're going to be fighting for it all year, and I think that could be really healthy. It's going to be really healthy competition. And I've heard good things about Tariq too. I mean, he's looking good.
I really, I think like with training camp, it's always a good time to emphasize that, especially in this first week, because I've been doing this for years now where I read all the training camp reports around the league. Very curious to see like which guys to get ahead of, like which guys could be good players in the league, especially new guys or guys in new roles or guys taking that next leap, and there was a bunch in the last few years that it's turned out to be true. And, all the positive things turned out to be really good. So, there's that. But then also in that first week of training camp, especially in that first maybe 2 weeks, it's like you'll get a lot of names that are standing out. And then 3 weeks from now, we're saying whatever happened to that guy that was standing out. But in Tariq Woolen's case, I think it's good that a guy who's so raw at the position, a former wide receiver transitioning to cornerback in the last couple of years, 1 or 2 years, for him to have any sort of moments in the NFL and an NFL training camp, good positive sign. But obviously with Kobe Bryant, who won the award as the top defensive back in college football last year, it's a different thing than being a top ranked prospect, but still a guy that was coming in with a lot of accolades and a lot of experience, at least for college players at cornerback. Would make sense that Bryant starts right away, but that the hope is obviously that Tariq Woolen can be a starter in the long-term future. And then Trey Brown, has he been practicing or he hasn't been?
No, he's I think he's on the pup.
Yeah, it looks like he is on the physically unable to perform list, which means he
That
can
was
come
to
off
be
at any point.
expected. That was to be expected.
I mean, it's not. It's brings us to another point, which is Jamal Adams broken finger, expected to miss probably most of training camp at this point, if not all of training camp at this point. And my thoughts on that are that it's never good. It's never like you get any injury news and it's good. And with Jamal Adams, a player that came in with such high expectations, you just kind of want the moment to happen where he's just being great, and so anytime he's not able to participate, it's frustrating. And knowing that he missed 5 games last year, it's doubly frustrating. And so that's part of it. But on the other hand, I'm just like, if you're playing at this, if you're getting paid at this level, then there is this certain expectation that you should be an all-pro performer with or without practice. So hopefully if he is able to play by week 1, none of this matters. And so that's what I would say on the optimistic angle is, hey, if he's able to play by week 1, I have the expectation that Jamal Adams is good enough to not need that practice. And if that's too much of an expectation, then I think there has been a misjudgment then on his value. I mean, I think it just needs to be able to step in and play right away, even though there are going to be changes to the defense this year, as we know. And it sounds like Ryan Neal is going to be taking his place with the ones. So more opportunities, I guess, for Ryan Neal as well. Right, Thad?
Yeah. And again, I think it speaks to our depth and the scheme, how it's going to change, where Ryan Neal, they're going to incorporate his talents more instead of kind of just using him as a stopgap as they have the last couple years. So I'm, I know that Adams is like, it's a disappointing thing. Most likely he won't be up to speed if he doesn't play until game 1, he'll probably need a couple games to kind of get his feet underneath him, get his bearings, I mean, football contracts are different, right? Like, I think with like baseball, like you can get mad at a team who maybe doesn't do much else besides sign like if they need a pitcher, they sign a pitcher with injury history, and then the pitcher spends the length of the contract being hurt, but I don't think even with like Penny, but I don't think with Adams you can get that frustrated, because football is just, you really have no control over when guys get hurt or how they get hurt. You know what I mean?
It's, we focus so much on injuries at certain positions that I think we forget injuries happen everywhere on the field, like at a very high rate. It's a very, team, right? What's that?
And to every team as well.
Every team, then there's those years like last season, the Rams won the Super Bowl, and you could really point to the fact that Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp, Aaron Donald, Jalen Ramsey, these are their 4 best players. Everybody knows this about the Rams. They're elite players at their position. I mean, obviously Stafford is more of like a very great, very good quarterback, as opposed to the other guys could be all pros, first team, you know what I mean? And they didn't miss any time. There was Jalen Ramsey suffered a shoulder injury in the playoffs, but played through it and didn't have a very good playoffs. But they have Kupp and Stafford and Donald all out there doing their thing. They add Von Miller. He's healthy. Like all those players, all the up in the time until Odell Beckham Jr. tore his ACL in the Super Bowl. There were injuries that happened to the Rams, like Robert Woods and everything. But overall, it's like there's the Rams with that. But then on the other hand, there's going to be maybe this season someone on the Rams that's very key. One of those 4 key players gets injured. I don't want any players to get injured, really. So, there's that. But at the end of the day, it could happen. It could happen to the Seahawks. It could happen. It happened to the Seahawks last year with Russell Wilson. So, the difference there could be as simple as, one little finger injury changes the course of your entire year. But that does happen to everyone everywhere. And if that's and all at once. And so once you think about that fact and go, like, it's easy to get so frustrated with, say, one injury, like a Jamal Adams injury or any kind of injury. But in the context of the entire league, it's like every fan, with the exception of maybe a couple of teams, is going through that with somebody. So it's just part of the game. And I think it's also just kind of funny because in this time where so many people have been making this argument against drafting Kenneth Walker and running backs and blah, 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 it's funny because it is, you can point to it and go like, well, no, I'm cherry picking some of these injuries, and it's going to make it look bad, like Saquon Barkley and Christian McCaffrey and all that kind of stuff. And I get that because as I've said forever, running backs take the most abuse. Why wouldn't it be the most injured position? That makes sense that it would be a thing where, the person that's sacrificing their body for 300 plays a game as opposed to a wide receiver who, for the most part will avoid any of those major hits. But it's still, when you go back and you look at the track record of draft picks and first round busts and all that kind of stuff, you can find, hey, it could be a running back injury, but could also be Andrew Luck. It could be Robert Griffin III. It could be, trying to think of a wide receiver, but there's plenty of wide receivers whose careers have been derailed by injuries. Plenty of lots of cornerbacks had their careers derailed by injuries. So it does happen everywhere. And I do think that of all the things that could have happened to Jamal Adams, a broken finger sounds pretty good, relatively speaking. So that's one thing to think about with the secondary. What do you think, like, in terms of the strength of Seattle's defense this coming season? Because if you had to point to any one unit, obviously we know that there are the units that are either they were bad last season or let's say below expectations, like the pass rushing. We know this, and we know that there's moves to try and change that this year. And we know that the cornerbacks, like I said, it's kind of a patchworked together unit right now, as while they're waiting to see if any of the young guys are going to become really good starters. But other than that, it's like a patchworked cornerbacks unit. And then, there's the veterans sparse throughout there. But what would you say is the strength of Seattle's defense?
It seems like the strength is going to be the line, the interior, the defensive line. It seems like it just seems like it's where Pete wants it to be. And I think with, comparing, it's not always good to compare eras and whatnot, but I think when you look at when Pete Carroll has been the most successful as a coach, when the defense has been the most successful, is when the defensive line has been disruptive. They can play the run. They can get pressure on the quarterback, not always get sacks, but they pressure the quarterback, which evidently leads to sacks, so eventually leads to sacks. So I would say the defensive line, and that's really encouraging, because if the defensive line can be disruptive, then that makes it easier for the cornerbacks to make big plays. It's going to make it easier on the linebackers, which I think the linebackers is probably my most concern I have on the defense, is for our depth.
Are you talking about specifically the inside linebackers?
Linebackers in general. I just think we don't have.
You're talking about Uchenna Nwosu and Darrell Taylor?
Well, with the 3-4, right, they're going to play a hybrid of end and linebacker.
That's why I'm kind of clarifying, like, exactly.
Yeah, so I guess it would be the interior, right? Like you have Barton,
Jordan
and you have
Brooks, Cody Barton,
and then who else do you really have in there? You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's not really at this point, there's a lot of camp talk about Cody Barton and being excited about his, but even the people who are positively speaking about the way he's playing in camp or with his previous opportunity last year, in a limited action, there's just nobody knows. We have to go out there and we have to see it. So you're right. There's not a lot of experience there. And it's like, as far as Jordan Brooks taking that next step, we have to go out there and see it happen, even if we feel positively that it will happen. And then, as you say, depth, Iggy, Ugabini, I should be able to say it by now, and I didn't get it yet. So my apologies. But you're right. Tanner Muse, we know that John Radigan is out. So even less depth there at inside linebacker. So I have to agree that makes sense. And I pulled up overthecap.com here because, as you say, the strength, maybe it's the interior of that defensive line, which isn't necessarily usually the case with Pete Carroll. I think obviously if Jamal Adams is healthy, or even if he isn't, having Quandre Diggs and another safety back there, that's going to be something to Seattle's benefit as well. But it's funny that here we are at this point now, and Poona Ford, still the highest paid player on the roster for this season at $10 million. DK Metcalf just getting a raise, and he's going up to $8.8 million against the cap this year. And that's another consideration for next year, which is that Poona Ford is a undrafted, not an undrafted. He is an undrafted free agent, an unrestricted free agent, and so that's another guy that they have to decide what his long-term future with the team really will be, especially because Al Woods, is probably just signed for 1 year. Maybe he'll be able to last longer than that, but he's 35 years old. Brian Monet has been extended, as you say, so they feel pretty good about that. Quinn Jefferson, still a couple of years away from 30, feels like he's been around forever, but Quinn Jefferson is like 28 years old. So Ford, Woods, Monet, Jefferson, and then you've got Miles Adam and Matt Gotel as the depth there. But I still think the Seahawks, and I've said this, if the Seahawks, whether they do or don't draft a quarterback in the first round, they've got 2 first-round picks and a defensive tackle or a nose tackle. Makes a lot of sense at this point. Could be another position, of course, but there's guys like Jalen Carter out of Georgia. There's a guy at Clemson, Brian Breesy. So those are 2 guys that could go in the top 10 of the draft next year, depending on where Seattle's draft pick is. We could see that happening, but I think it is something, Thad, that they do want and have always wanted, is that strong interior defensive line presence. And if they can find somebody who's also a pass rusher in that regard, that would be even better. Still waiting kind of for somebody to fill that role, since Jordan Hill, really, back in like 2014, was a guy that could get in there and disrupt the passer and then couldn't stay healthy going back to health. But yeah, I think, with camp going on, it's easy to get more optimistic about the Seahawks the closer you get to the season, especially now that DK Metcalf's been signed. And so that's something to, feel more optimistic about. And it's hard not to start thinking about the best case scenario for everybody in camp, especially the guys standing out like Kobe Bryant, and thinking of it in terms of like, what could be the best case scenario here. But in general, we'll see what happens. I think I could talk myself into seeing the Seahawks make the playoffs at 9-8 or 8-9 or something like that, just because someone in the NFC could get in with a record like that. So I could talk myself into that. Do you feel any better about the quarterback situation after the first 3-4 days of camp?
I mean, from what I've heard, it's everything that I knew of before, with one additional wrinkle that I was excited to hear about. The 2 things that I already knew, or at least I had already heard, was that Geno Smith has been really good with his intermediate throws. His 5-yard throws have been on point. His 15-yard throws have been on point. His 20-yard throws have been on point. Anything after 30 yards, he's having trouble. Which was expected. And then with Drew Lock, I've heard his decision-making has been highly questionable. Like, he's made plays. He throws a better deep ball, but he also makes a lot of really weird, like, brain farty plays. And so I heard that. But one thing that I heard, so that was to be expected. But the one thing I heard from Tyler Lockett, which is what I've been waiting to hear, is Jacob Eason's doing really, really good. He's doing really well. He's picking up the offense. He's playing. He's making the throws he needs to make. He's staying late. He's working with the coaches. He hasn't. I think the Hawks are going to. I think one of the surprises is the Hawks are going to carry 3 quarterbacks. I really think that they're going to carry 3 quarterbacks this year, and I think that Eason is kind of a wild card in that sense. Because honestly, I feel like the Seahawks. I don't know what the like with Locke. I think they like his physical ability, right? Like, they like his arm, but if he can't really figure out how to run a team, I don't think they're going to be. I don't know what it will do to the cap, but I think they might. If Locke doesn't work out, they'll just cut him. You know what I mean? At the end of the year.
Yeah, I mean, that seems I mean, like at the end of the day, there is that point of this game, just 99% of this game takes place above the neck, so it's like, as much as talented as Drew Lock is, if he doesn't know how to make the right decision, even if he makes, because it only takes one, but for Drew Lock, it was like 4 or 5, 10 horrible decisions maybe per game. So you can't get into that situation where you're putting Drew Lock out there and saying, just because he can throw a 50-yard touchdown bomb or, hit some of those throws that maybe Geno Smith can't hit. If he's going out there and making 4 huge mistakes, he's not going to have the talent to make up for it like a Matthew Stafford does. It's like Matthew Stafford can make 3 huge mistakes and still come back to win the game. So that's not where we would ever be at, or that's not where we're currently at with Drew Lock, thinking that just because he's making some mistakes that he'll be able to make up for it. So he either needs to cut out on the mistakes or get a lot better in all the other situations. And, I've definitely been on the record of saying 2 things, really. I've said I'm rooting for Geno Smith. I think it's a cool story, and it would be really it'd be fine if he came out there as a starter just based on what Seattle needs to do over these next 2 years. So that would be fine to me. I also have said that I expect Drew Lock to be a starter just because that seems to be the move that would be that would have, some sort of upside. And you would think, okay, in terms of like maybe doing what's best sometimes for Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, having a guy out there who I just have a lot more faith in on some of those deep passing attempts, because Geno Smith just doesn't really have any passes that go past 20, 25 yards. It's just kind of like that difference. But the biggest issue for Jacob Eason moving forward will just be getting reps, because from what I understand, also, you're pretty much splitting reps between 2 guys already to be the number 1. You got almost nothing left over for Jacob Eason. So it's just one of those situations where, as a player, this is one of the hardest things to overcome, which is if you're buried on a depth chart, it's really difficult for coaches, because the coaches only get so many snaps per practice with the starters. So for them to start moving chess pieces around because you did better against the 2s and the 3s, it becomes very difficult, because now you're taking those reps away from the guy that you said was the starter, that you're expecting to be the starter. You can't take any reps away from anybody. So you really have to be in that position to think like, no, we need to bench somebody before we can promote somebody. It's very hard to just promote somebody. So yeah, for Jacob Eason, if he's getting 20% or 10% of that day's snaps, just very difficult for him to stand out, especially if he's throwing against the undrafted free agent cornerbacks and he's not getting time with DK Metcalf, all that stuff. It's just going to be interesting to move forward, but it could just take one preseason game or, one day where a guy's not available and Jacob Eason gets moved up to the 1s or the 2s. You never know, and like, I agree with you that there's really not that much to lose to try, an Eason out.
Yeah.
The gap between Jacob Eason and Geno Smith, I mean, what is it really? It is just that veteran experience, that familiarity with this team, all that kind of stuff. We'll see what happens. I can't wait to see the first 2 preseason games. I hate preseason just in the terms of the way that people start going like, he had 100 yards. He's got to make the team. It's like, that's where I think we need to do a deeper analysis than how guys do stat wise. But I can't wait to see these games, to see the way that these guys do just sort of play in a competitive football environment. So yeah, it sounds like you were going to say that you're also pretty pumped for this particular preseason.
Oh, very, very excited. I mean, usually you're looking at, the last 10 years, what we've been looking at is like, okay, what kind of adjustments has the offensive line made? Because we know that the offensive line's been a problem over the last 10 years, and then you're looking at the defensive players that we drafted and see how they're going to pop off the page, pop off the screen. But this year you're kind of looking at every position group, literally, right? Like,
yeah.
That Waldron wants to have more 2 tight end sets, and the 3rd receiver is going to be really important this year because you need to help protect the quarterback, right? So the tight ends and the 3rd receiver are going to inevitably become more involved in the offense this year. So
yeah, and speaking of that, like, just also like with D. Eskridge as the wide receiver 3, like I'm more annoyed that D. Eskridge would miss 2 days of practice than if Jamal Adams misses the whole time, because D. Eskridge, you just got to get in there, man. Like, you got to get in there, man. We don't want to see you held back. And this, I know it's like, it's just, I hate these hamstrings. Why do they give people so much problems? But you just got to get in there, man. Like there's no other way to get a job. There's no other way to get these opportunities if you're not in there. So that's what I was really frustrating, is finding that wide receiver 3 has been such a issue. Whether it was with Russell Wilson or now in the post Russell Wilson era, it's just like getting into that third receiver position. It seems so difficult, which is again why I think wide receiver could be a priority in the draft next year too. And there's a lot of really interesting guys coming to the league that could play that slot role. That could be that wide receiver 3 that could fit into a Shane Waldron offense. As you're saying, tight end depth will be very important. And I think there are so many things that we will start to see flesh out here in those 2-3 preseason games. I said that we would preview the 2023 team, just kind of like to say that now that DK Metcalf is guaranteed to be around in 2023, and because 2023 is really just such a key ultimate season in this whole plan that started since the Russell Wilson trade, having those 2 first-round draft picks, those 2 second-round draft picks acquired in the trade. And so having 2 firsts in 2022 and in 2023, 2 seconds in both of those years, it's really nice to start looking at like, well, what are those? How could these things shake out? So let's, we've only got about 10 minutes left, but let's get into the depth charts that we could expect maybe in 2023, now that there's been some changes made. So as far as the free agents next year, just to get this out of the way, it looks like the guys who could be on the way out, Cody Barton, we talked about, inside linebacker, could need a new inside linebacker. Marquise Blair, who doesn't see a lot of time in his first 3 years, don't know what his role will be this year on the team, what, health wise, what's going on there. But obviously defensive back help could be on the way again next year. Of course, in the form of cornerback, we are looking at Travis Homer, Geno Smith among the free agents, Phil Haynes, and Ben Burke-Irvin, who is not on the who was cut, obviously. Nick Bellore. Overall, the Seahawks are pretty well locked in. Poona Ford, I said Justin Coleman, Austin Blythe, Sidney Jones. So all those cornerbacks, Drew Lock, Ugo Amadi. So yeah, a lot of cornerbacks going out in free agency. LJ Collier, I don't know if we don't even know if he will make the team. Artie Burns, Rashad Penny, of course, signed to a 1-year contract. Jason Myers going into the final year of his contract. Tyler Ott, I should say. Long snapper, I guess. But so that's kind of a look at it in terms of the potential free agents. And I think the Seahawks, they took care of the free agent that they needed to take care of on Thursday. But, drafting Kenneth Walker doesn't necessarily do anything to prevent the Seahawks from re-signing Rashad Penny next year if he has a good season, and I think that would be in the plan. I think if Rashad Penny has a good season, he's going to be – if he even gets off to a good start, I think that the Seahawks could give him an extension in the season, kind of a – let's just say that he is like one of the top backs in the first month of the year, then the Seahawks could easily give him a, kind of like a Chris Carson type deal, 2-year contract extension, maybe in the range of $20 million, which, would be really upsetting to a lot of people, but maybe where he could fall in that it's $10 million maybe for, for you starting a star running back, potentially seeing what Rashad Penny does. And you want 2 running backs complementing each other these days. So having Walker and Penny together for multiple years would be, I think, a very good thing. Any sort of insight into where you expect Penny to be?
I mean, I think they're going to wait till the end of the season. I think they want to test his market value after this year, but I would wait as well. I mean, he's never been healthy, I would hope they wouldn't sign him during the season, even if he looks really good, because the chances of him getting hurt this year are like really high,
Yeah, that's a very good point.
I mean, I really expect him to have a season where he's like super efficient. He averages over 100 yards a game, has a handful of touchdowns, but he's probably only going to play 8 or 9 games this year. I mean, I really think that's the case,
I mean, it's fair to be cautious with Rashad Penny always. And, the fact that the Seahawks did re sign DK Metcalf, it leaves them open to use the franchise tag next year on a different player. So if Rashad Penny had a Jonathan Taylor type season, you could always franchise tag him. And, then you're just playing him on that 1-year contract again. I think you'd be around 10 or $11 million. So you're looking at, that's kind of also where the extension talks would go, is centered around that kind of money. But yeah, once you sign a player in a 1-year contract, just let him play out that contract and see how that goes. The wide receivers, DK Metcalf here, Tyler Lockett, probably here, there's talk that could be made, I guess, but ultimately I think Tyler Lockett should have at least another 2-3 years in the NFL as a starter. And so I think he's a guy that loves being with Seattle, loves being on the Seahawks, feels like a guy who would like to, nobody really ever does, but would like to play his entire career with one team. We'll see how that goes. But then everything after that, you've got Freddie Swain, D. Eskridge, Cody Thompson, Marquise Goodwin, Penny Hart, the rookies, Derek Young, Bo Melton. Overall, Aaron Fuller, Deontay Alexander, Kay Johnson. Overall, nobody really standing out to me guaranteed to be a part of this team in 2023 outside of DK and Tyler. Obviously, the expectations for D. Eskridge will put him in that place. But 10 targets or whatever it was last year, we just haven't seen him. And like I said, you got to be out there. Would you pick any of these wide receivers for, having a big role on the offense in 2023?
I mean, they drafted D. Eskridge specifically to have a bigger role, and Swain has continued to prove to be reliable. But no, I think it's like there's so much. This roster, a lot of the roster is set up to have guys prove themselves, which I think is another reason why I'm excited.
So nobody really at this point.
They have to make themselves in. They have to make themselves. That's what I'm excited about. They have to make themselves indisposable. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly. But at this point, I think is very likely that the Seahawks could be in the market for a wide receiver in 2023, whether that be in the draft. We did see Pete Carroll go after Sidney Rice and Percy Harvin, so he's not afraid of maybe targeting wide receivers if they are kind of in that premier market. And we did see, Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill and multiple players at receiver get traded this year. And I do think that now that you've got DK Metcalf on the extension and you still have to pay Tyler Lockett for the next couple of years, probably not going to be a move for a player who costs a lot of money, but maybe there's going to be reclamation projects, maybe somebody hopefully better than N'Keal Harry, but maybe someone in that same sort of scenario, some more names to be brought in. But hopefully, as you say, the reason that you draft D. Eskridge in the second round is that he's the guy for you. So we'll see what happens with D. Eskridge. More likely than not, I would say wide receiver is a position that the Seahawks, I would be in my, the Seahawks have 4 picks in the first 2 rounds. Wide receiver would be one of my top 4 positions of need of draft likelihood in 2023, undoubtedly. The offensive line, Charles Cross, obviously in the plans for the next 4 years and beyond. Yeah, and that's the position that I expected the Seahawks to draft, left tackle specifically with their top 10 pick, and Charles Cross comes in. At right tackle, you've got Jay Curhan and Amp Lucas as the 2 guys battling to be the starter opposite of Charles Cross. Obviously, I think what's really interesting to me is if Jay Curhan wins the starting job, which he might very well do, did pretty well at the end of last year, and he's getting his opportunity now, is if he wins the job and then he has a really good season, I don't know where that leaves Abe Lucas. I don't know if there's any position versatility, with either of those players, not that it's a bad problem to have, and especially for the Seahawks who don't ever have depth at tackle. I think the big thing is maybe Jay Curhan could actually win the job and do well. And then you've got Abe Lucas next year just trying to because the interior of the offensive line could be completely turned over in the next year. The D. Eskridge maybe of the interior of the offensive line being Damian Lewis, You've got the first season. You've got the second season. Any thoughts there, Thad, on the third season of Damian Lewis?
You just hope that it just feels like a lot of the things on this team were schemed wrong the last couple years. And you just hope that, I mean, he's certainly talented enough. It seems like he's been on the left. They haven't really tried to experiment with putting him back on the right. So you hope that some continuity there. He gets another year to kind of, I mean, from what I've read and heard, and and this is just something that I've heard echoed for as long as I've been following football, like really when you put a guy at a new position on the offensive line, like especially a guy who played his rookie year on one side and then playing his second year on the second side, his second year even should be considered as a rookie year, because you are doing something entirely new and you're moving your body in a different way. So he's just another player on this team that is like, we've kind of been in this funk with over the last 10 years with the Seahawks, where they draft these players that maybe were drafted too high or were sort of on this wild card tip. We know about Tom Cable, not as much on the defense, but certainly on the offensive line, we've been sort of used to these like question marks. Even J.R. Sweezy, like he's one of the great wild card picks on as far as them picking offensive line, but he also was a wild card. He was like a two-sport athlete. He wasn't really like, didn't he like only start playing tackle in like college or something? Like, but now we're getting these players who just like kind of need a little room to grow. Like they have the basics down, you know what I mean? Whereas we're kind of drafted these like low ceiling, high, like low floor, high ceiling guys. Like we're drafting guys who are sort of like mid-tier with their floor already. Like, they're not going to be like terrible, right? Like at worst, they're going to be average, but for us to be the kind of Super Bowl team that we want Damian Lewis to be a well above average guard. You know what I mean? So
yeah. So
I think it's just another example of some of these like guys that have the tools. They just need a little space. They need a little good luck, and they need a little good coaching, and I think, and they'll be fine,
Yeah, that's another player. It's right that even moving from left to right or right to left, and even if it's the same position, it's a different position altogether. So
yeah,
it's totally fair. Yeah, there's all types of things involved in playing guard. The left guard could pull a lot more than the right guard. The left guard, in terms of, and then just the general like, it's going this way instead of that way. It seems very simple, but it isn't. And so, it's also about getting the offensive lineman in. It might be a full flip within a couple of years of getting the offensive line out. That was Mike Solari, and getting the offensive line in. That's Andy Dickerson, and all that entails. And so Damian Lewis, the guy that definitely has the highest odds, I think, of being around the Seahawks and still with the Seahawks in 2023. And I know that there's a lot of people who prioritize center very highly, and I appreciate that and I respect that. And it could be the Seahawks, who have spent, late second round picks on centers with Pete Carroll, and maybe into that day 3 area more likely. But overall, I think could the Seahawks draft a center in the second round last year if there was somebody that they were super high on? Absolutely. I also think, with this week in Bucs camp, Pro Bowl center Ryan Jensen gets injured and is probably, I think, it's called a very serious knee injury. I didn't look at the updates today or anything.
Yeah,
but
it's out for the year, right?
Out for the year. So you got Ryan Jensen going out. You've got Ali Marbit, one of their great guards, retiring this year. They have to replace their other starting guard, Alex Kappa. And I'm not saying that won't impact the Bucs, because I'm sure that it will. But I am saying no writer is going to change how many wins that they were going to give the Bucs, I think, based on Ryan Jensen's injury. I think most people are going to say, well, you've still got Tom Brady. That's kind of like what the whole Tom Brady reputation is. And I would say, there's been a lot of just sort of centers and guards that have, just rotated around the league. And most people probably couldn't name the Rams center. I don't think most people could name the Bengals center from last year. I don't think most people could name the guards on those teams. And that's fine. I just think that when we're talking about the most impactful, valued positions for teams that need really important positions to be fortified, center might be lower on the priority for the Seahawks at this juncture in their development as a roster. However, if there's a guy out there that they love, they may go and use that pick as high as the late first round, like the Patriots did with Cole Strange this year. So I'm not throwing it out, but I would say it wouldn't surprise me to see the Seahawks maybe prioritize other positions ahead of that, even though Austin Blythe seems like a bridge center and Gabe Jackson, a veteran who may not have that much longer with the Seahawks. We'll find out. But overall, I think the offense, by next year, we could see a lot of the same names, but the big name that will need to be added to the roster next year is at quarterback. So knowing that when we're looking at the 2023 roster, we're talking about probably someone different than Geno Smith or Drew Lock. We're probably talking about Kenneth Walker moving up to being that starting running back. Maybe the Seahawks do bring back Rashad Penny. If they don't, then I think running back could be a priority in the draft again, even if it's the third round or the fourth round. I could see the Seahawks continuing to fortify that running back position. Offensive line, I think they like the tackles that they have right now, and I think that the interior of the offensive line would be a priority. And I think the wide receiver position after DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett is a huge priority for me personally. So quarterback would be the biggest priority. Receiver would probably be the second biggest priority. The Seahawks have their tight ends locked in for next year. So you would think Will Disley, Noah Fant definitely going to be around. Colby Parkinson going into his third year this year. But overall, I think that's the biggest change there with the offense is obviously quarterback, and I think getting another wide receiver and potentially adding another running back. We're running out of time, so let's quickly just evaluate the defense. We talked about the interior of the defensive line. Al Woods, 35 years old, on a one-year contract. Poona Ford is a free agent after the year. Quentin Jefferson, I don't know how much longer so in general, I think, as I said before, I think interior defensive line will be a priority in the draft next year, potentially even the first pick that the Seahawks use. Just thinking about, Jordan Davis coming out of Georgia this year and how highly some people were on Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt, his partner there at Georgia. Jalen Carter played behind those guys at Georgia, and most people say he's better than both of them. So, if you can add a guy like that to impact the interior of your defensive line, even in a 3-4, we've seen how big of an impact Aaron Donald has on the league. We've seen how big of an impact Vita Vea had with the Bucs. We see these guys have a huge impact. So I think that's interesting that there's so many guys in Seattle that are set to be free agents or may not have that long of a road ahead. And then even with Brian Mone, it's like, well, what's his ceiling, as opposed to a guy that you draft in the first or second round. We'll see what that looks like. And as you said, you really are high on these guys this year. So, we'll kind of see how that shakes out. Do you have concerns about the run defense this season?
Only from a schematic point, because it's going to be a new scheme, but I think it seems like it's going to carry over. I would only, the only thing that really concerns me about the new scheme is Wosu. Is he going to be good at stopping the run? Mafe, like when they need to, right? Because they're obviously going to be in there to rush the passer more often than not. But I'm otherwise, though, it seems like through all the ups and downs of the Seahawks, that they've had over the last 10 years, they've always been pretty, above average at stopping the run. So,
yeah, I think what Pete would obviously love is how can he be great? How can he be the best team in the NFL at stopping the run? So that's definitely going to be Pete Carroll's expectation, and we'll see, especially at this point, I think he's definitely going to see that as the starting point, when you don't have the greatest cornerbacks in the league, and when you've got, sort of just a a bunch of unknowns, maybe as edge rushers, and new players as inside linebackers, and it definitely comes down to, well, can you stop the guys up front? Can you make it very difficult in the trenches there? And adding into that Shelby Harris, LJ Collier as the defensive ends. Neither of those players to me seem like great bets to be around in 2023. LJ Collier, a free agent. Shelby Harris, there's a lot of cap savings. I'll just say that. So, we'll see where that goes. And even if you did bring back Shelby Harris, or if you didn't cut Shelby Harris, I think drafting a defensive end, maybe in round 2, probably more like in round 3 or 4, I think that's something that we could see the Seahawks do next year. That's not the same as an edge. That's just a defensive end on the defensive line. As an edge, the Seahawks have Darrell Taylor, Uchenna Nwosu, Boy Mafe, Alton Robinson, Tyreek Smith, who is on PUP. Looking at those guys, I think the expectations are very high and hopeful for Taylor, Nwosu, Mafe. If Nwosu doesn't have a good season, the Seahawks will cut him because there's also a lot of savings there. It's kind of his prove-it season to earn that contract next year.
Yeah.
So, and it does matter just how he does, not just in rushing the passer, but is he a 70% snap guy? Is he a 40% snap guy? That's what we'll find out, and that will impact his value quite a bit. I still think even adding Boy Mafe, who some people are super high on, it would be a priority in the draft next year. Again, maybe with that number 1 pick that they use to get an edge rusher, there are guys out there that you could say in a certain scenario, the Seahawks, if they had a top 3 pick, would draft maybe Will Anderson out of Alabama, maybe getting one of these premier elite edge rushers if that was available to him, even over a quarterback, depending on the availabilities there. But edge is going to be a priority, and I think the guys that we can guarantee around for next season, close to guarantee, would be Mafe, Taylor. I don't know, if Alton Robinson has a super high ceiling. I don't know where he could go from here. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I love Alton Robinson. I mean, my last name is Robinson, so that's number 1. But number 2, no, I mean, I think he's, he's had a small sample size, right? So he's another one of these guys that we're going to see. We're going to be able to read the temperature on the defense as far as how they're utilizing certain positions, how they're utilizing players that probably needed more snaps, at least more consistent snaps during the Ken Norton era. And again, I think it's just another exciting position where you see potential. You've seen him flash, make some good plays. So it's not a wild card. You hope the new scheme will have him in better position, and then he can, and then all these guys, because we have so much cap space, it's like, hey, look, if you play well, you're most, because of the way the Seahawks, like you said, the Seahawks always prioritize their own free agents above all else. So if you play well this year, you're going to get signed. You're going to get re-signed, and that's exciting, right? It's all these guys who have something to prove, whether it's Collier, even with Collier, I root for him to figure things out. I root for the scheme to be more to his liking, and I want, even with Gino, I root for them to figure out how to prove it, and to show off and to show their worth,
Yeah, Robinson signed for 2 more years. So if Alton Robinson has a good year, the Seahawks will have him through 2023. And Tyreek Smith not being out there, never a good thing. I think for him, my ceiling was Benson Mayowa, or at least a comp, maybe like a Benson Mayowa, which is very good to have, especially on a cheap 5th round contract. So, potentially something there. Definitely see that as a priority. Inside linebacker we talked about. I think it would be fair to expect Jordan Brooks to be on the Seahawks next year. Whether they pick up his 5th-year option will depend on his play this year, like you say, how he goes out there and plays. And then Cody Barton, a free agent after the year. I think inside linebacker, off-ball linebacker is a thing that you can find on day 3 and be okay and get away with that, and doesn't necessarily have to be the priority. Not a lot of guys out there you hate to even say Micah Parsons. He's not a real comparison for other inside linebackers, or even a guy like Roquan Smith. I guess if the Seahawks were in such a position in the draft to get a guy that they thought would be like Roquan Smith or Micah Parsons, then yeah, they could go and maybe add that guy to a defense, because what defense wouldn't want someone like that? So it's just not necessarily going to be a priority unless there was an exceptional opportunity. And so I think overall, you can maybe expect a new starter at off-ball linebacker, whether that's because Cody Barton maybe plays his way into a bigger deal somewhere else or doesn't play into a second deal. That's up to Cody Barton and the way that things go. Cornerbacks, we talked about, could be a completely new unit next season in terms of the starters. Maybe Kobe Bryant does start right away in Seattle, and then he's going into his second year next year. If that's the case, maybe Sidney Jones does play his way into a new contract past this season. Obviously, that is the hope for the Seattle Seahawks, to see Sidney Jones continue to build off of what he did in the second half last year. Trey Brown, Tariq Woolen. There's a couple of, I should say, names that could step up and into starting roles. And then obviously I think Seattle and everyone expects Jamal Adams and Quandre Diggs to be the safeties next season, especially Quandre Diggs. Jamal Adams, similar to D. Eskridge, hey, we just want to see you out there getting those reps and just being a part of the defense and winning those fans back on your side who are, thinking about draft picks and first round picks and everything like that. So overall, I think it would be, surprising to see a safety prioritized in the draft next year, unless he, it does happen, maybe someone like a Kyle Hamilton kind of situation falls into your lap and you just go like, let's do it. But overall, cornerback, probably a bigger priority. And at the end of the day, though, Pete Carroll, like I said, just going with what he normally does. He doesn't normally go after day one cornerbacks, day two cornerbacks at all, not even on, the third round. It's very rare. So they drafted, Kobe Bryant in the fourth round with the that is like a second round pick for Pete Carroll at cornerback. That is like, pick 35 or something like that. If he's drafting a guy in the fourth round, if he's taking Tariq Woolen in the fifth round, that's a guy that he's pretty high on. So if I was just going with expectations, I would say that next year's draft, cornerback probably lower on the priority than an edge rusher, than a defensive tackle, than a quarterback, of course, then a wide receiver. Maybe then, after you get past those top four, for me, I would be looking more at the interior of the defensive line, the interior of the offensive line. I think obviously the interior of the defensive line would be a high priority, and then inside linebacker in that group with maybe cornerbacks and center and running back. So highest priority, quarterback, obviously. They hope that the right guy lands in their laps in the draft. Can't dictate that. But then after that, edge rusher, interior pass rusher, and a wide receiver, for me personally, thinking that way. Thad, we're running out of time here, but I feel pretty good about the 2023 Seahawks as well as the 2022 Seahawks. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I feel real good. I think the draft really set the tone. I really think getting away from the ex-girlfriend was a big deal, and then the draft showing that we're going to make smart decisions, we're going to make we're going to make thoughtful decisions, we're going to trust our new coaches, we're going to trust Dickerson and Waldron and Desai and Scott and Hurt, and Pete's going to guide them. Obviously, Schneider's going to guide them. But, I think it's a little bit of a celebration. Like, let's be excited too. Like, look, we had a great time with Russell. You know what I mean? Like, but look, who's really the second coming of Russell is DK Metcalf, somebody that was, kind of thought of as not being as advanced as far as his football IQ, which is shown to be that wasn't a fully well thought out idea. He really does know his stuff. He dropped, a second round receiver like him, to me, is like Russell dropping in the third round. Like, his talent, and we signed him and he wanted to be here and there was no drama. And, everybody's really excited about the young players. Everybody's really excited about the team. So if the players are excited, that makes me excited,
Yep. I definitely feel that there's a different energy, and people just feel like anytime that something feels new, and if you change out the head coach or the franchise quarterback, it's going to feel new. And anytime something's new, that means anything is possible. And so I think the Seahawks definitely, no team for the most part ever goes into camp or comes out of camp thinking that they're going to be 3-14 or the worst team in the league. They all feel pretty good about themselves, and I think that the Seahawks, because they didn't get rid of all of the experienced veterans. They didn't get rid of all the guys that didn't know what it's like to win. They didn't get rid of the whole. They didn't move Tyler Lockett. They didn't move. They re-signed Quandre Diggs. The energy is that DK Metcalf joined a team that's going to continue to compete. And if that wasn't the case, if the Seahawks had traded DK Metcalf, I think we'd be having a much different conversation. But we have had a conversation, and that's it for this episode of the Seaside Joe Show. I got a Seaside Joe go. Thank you, Thad. Once again, you can follow him on Twitter at ThatIsRad. He writes over there at fieldgoals.com, and you can follow on Field Goals on Twitter at Field Goals, and of course at Seaside Joe News for more Seaside Joe Seahawks content. It's every single day. SeasideJoe.substack.com. Over 3.5 years of not missing a day of Seahawks newsletters. So go ahead and find that and subscribe, and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you want to, because we'll be coming back more and more as the Seahawks season continues. I'm Kenneth Arthur. With me is Thad Wenatchee, and that's it for the Seaside Joe Show.